The clan that buried its newborns alive. A genetic curse so horrifying it defied all morality. These words alone are enough to send shivers down the spine. But the truth behind this statement is more disturbing than any fiction could ever portray. What you are about to discover is not some tale from the shadows of imagination, but a documented case that emerged from the isolated mountains of West Virginia. A tragedy that unfolded across generations, hidden from the world until authorities finally uncovered in 1973 what had been buried beneath the rocky soil of the Appalachian wilderness. The date was November 12, 1973. In Hollow Creek, a remote valley nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, the autumn leaves had already fallen from the twisted oak trees. Deputy Sheriff Thomas Garrett had been summoned to investigate a report from a concerned postal worker. The worker had noticed that the Carmichael family, residents of an isolated farmstead, hadn't collected their mail in over 3 weeks. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Barely visible, the dirt road leading to their property was overgrown with vegetation, marked only by decades-old tire tracks that had carved permanent grooves into the mountainside. As his vehicle struggled up the steep incline, Deputy Garrett couldn't shake a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The Carmichael family had lived in these mountains for over a century, rarely venturing into the small town of Beckley some 40 miles away. Local residents spoke of them in hushed tones, describing them as strange, reclusive people who kept to themselves and married within their own bloodline. But no one had truly understood the depth of horror that such isolation had bred. The farmhouse came into view as the deputy rounded the final bend. It was a decrepit structure, its wooden planks weathered gray by countless winters, windows covered with torn fabric instead of curtains. An absolute silence hung in the air, broken only by the wind whistling through the bare branches overhead. Deputy Garrett stepped from his vehicle, his boots crunching on the frost-covered ground, and called out. No response came. What he found inside that house would haunt him for the rest of his days. 17 people lived in conditions that defied human comprehension. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of unwashed bodies, decay, and something else, something that spoke of sickness and genetic deterioration. The family members he encountered ranged from infants to elderly adults, but what struck him immediately was that not a single one appeared normal by any medical standard. In a corner of the main room sat Margaret Carmichael, the matriarch. She was only 42 years old according to later records, yet she looked 70. Her face was severely deformed, with a protruding lower jaw that jutted forward at an unnatural angle, making speech nearly impossible. Her eyes, set too far apart, struggled to focus on him as he entered. She made only guttural sounds, her malformed mouth incapable of producing coherent words. Around her, children and young adults displayed a horrifying array of genetic abnormalities. 3 siblings aged between 8 and 14 shared the same grotesque facial features, eyes positioned at drastically different heights, noses flattened and twisted, ears that appeared to be melting into their skulls. 2 teenage boys sat motionless in wooden chairs, their bodies twisted by severe skeletal deformities, spines curved in ways that made standing upright impossible. Their legs were withered, muscles atrophied from what seemed a lifetime of immobility. But it was in a back bedroom that Deputy Garrett made the discovery that would transform this welfare check into an unprecedented criminal investigation. Behind a broken door, he found a young woman, no more than 19, lying on a filthy mattress. She was heavily pregnant, her belly swollen with what would be her 4th child. Beside her lay 3 wooden boxes, each no larger than a shoebox. Inside were the remains of 3 infants, wrapped in stained cloth, their tiny bodies showing clear signs of the same genetic abnormalities that plagued the rest of the family. The young woman, later identified as Sarah Carmichael, could barely communicate. Her cognitive abilities were severely compromised. Through gestures and the few words she could manage, she conveyed a truth that would shock investigators: these babies had been born alive, placed in these boxes, and buried in the woods behind the house within hours of their birth. The family had dug them up again during particularly harsh winters when food was scarce, though the deputy couldn't determine why they had kept them in the bedroom. As more law enforcement arrived throughout that cold November day, the full scope of the Carmichael family's situation began to emerge. The farmstead contained evidence of 6 generations of inbreeding dating back to 1847, when the family patriarch, Ezekiel Carmichael, first settled in this isolated valley. Birth records meticulously kept in a deteriorating family Bible revealed a pattern that made seasoned investigators physically ill: fathers mating with daughters, brothers with sisters, uncles with nieces, an endless cycle that had been occurring for over 125 years. Confirm your subscription, because what you're about to witness in the coming chapters will reveal one of the most shocking cases of genetic deterioration in American history, a story that medical professionals and sociologists still study today. Subscribe now, because this truth demands to be known, and those who turned away from this family's suffering must never be allowed to forget. To understand the horror of 1973, we must travel back to the autumn of 1847. Ezekiel Carmichael arrived in what would become West Virginia with his wife Ruth and their 6 children. A deeply religious man, he followed a small, obscure sect that believed in the absolute purity of bloodlines and the sinfulness of mixing with outsiders. This twisted, extreme belief system would become the foundation for 6 generations of suffering. Ezekiel purchased 200 acres of mountainous land for almost nothing, property so remote and difficult to access that neighboring settlers considered it worthless. But for Ezekiel, the isolation was precisely what he sought. He built a small cabin, expanded it over the years, and began establishing what he called God's pure family. Historical records from Raleigh County show Ezekiel rarely ventured into town, and when he did, local merchants noted his strange insistence on purchasing supplies for many more people than he claimed to have in his household. The first documented case of inbreeding in the Carmichael family occurred in 1863, during the height of the Civil War. Ezekiel's oldest son, Abraham, then 22, was arranged to marry his own sister, Rebekah, then 18. Ezekiel performed the ceremony himself, as no legitimate minister would sanction such a union. Rebekah gave birth to 7 children between 1864 and 1876. Only 4 survived past the age of 5. A traveling physician's journal from 1869 mentions visiting the Carmichael farm, noting the children showed peculiar facial characteristics and severe mental deficiencies. The parents refused recommendations for treatment, insisting God's will must not be questioned. By 1880, the family had expanded to 23 members all living on the same property. The census taker that year described the household as unlike any family I have encountered, noting many appeared related in multiple ways and showed signs of idiocy and physical malformation. The pattern continued. Ezekiel's grandson, Josiah Carmichael, born from the union of siblings Abraham and Rebekah, married his first cousin Martha in 1889. Their children displayed increasingly severe abnormalities. Of Martha's 12 pregnancies, only 6 children lived beyond their first year. Those who survived showed progressively worse deformities with each generation as the gene pool became more restricted. By the early 1900s, the Carmichaels had developed a grim tradition. Newborns who displayed the most severe deformities, those whose appearance was so shocking even family members recoiled, were not given the chance to suffer. Within hours of birth, these infants were placed in wooden boxes and buried in a clearing half a mile from the main house. No prayers were said, no markers placed. They simply disappeared into the rocky soil. A journal entry from 1912 provides a chilling glimpse, another one came today. It didn't look like a baby should look. We wrapped it up before it could make much noise. Thomas dug the hole like he always does. Ma says we've got 14 in the ground now, maybe more. Nobody keeps count anymore. The Great Depression brought the family to the edge of starvation. The isolation Ezekiel had sought as a blessing became a curse. With no connections to the outside world and a gene pool so contaminated most couldn't perform basic farm labor, the Carmichaels faced extinction. It was during this period the most disturbing practices emerged. Elmer Carmichael, great-great-grandson of Ezekiel, became patriarch in 1934. At 38, he already showed severe cognitive decline, a result of being the product of 4 generations of sibling marriages. Elmer had relationships with his 3 daughters simultaneously, and records suggest he may have also been intimate with his own mother. The family tree had become so convoluted determining exact relationships was nearly impossible. By 1950, the genetic deterioration had reached catastrophic levels. Photographs from a rare welfare visit show individuals whose appearances were so disturbed many today refuse to believe they were real human beings, heads enlarged to grotesque proportions, limbs twisted at impossible angles, faces collapsed inward. Yet the family continued, isolated and hidden, each generation more deformed than the last. The medical examination conducted over 3 months after their 1973 discovery revealed genetic damage of such magnitude that doctors from Johns Hopkins University traveled to West Virginia to study the case. Geneticist Dr. Helena Morrison described the family as the most severe case of genetic deterioration resulting from sustained inbreeding ever documented in modern American history. Of the 17 family members found alive, not a single one could be classified as mentally or physically normal. The youngest, an infant boy named Caleb, displayed microcephaly so severe his head circumference measured only 9 inches. His brain was approximately 40% smaller than average. Doctors estimated he had the cognitive capacity of a 3-month-old despite being 8 months old. 3 children, ages 5 to 9, were completely deaf and blind, victims of a genetic condition appearing in every generation since the 1920s. They had spent their lives confined to a single room, never taught to communicate. 7 individuals suffered from severe scoliosis and kyphosis, spines twisted into S and C shapes that compressed internal organs. X-rays revealed ribs fused together or growing at abnormal angles. 2 teenage boys, Marcus and Daniel, both 15 and products of a father-daughter relationship, had legs of drastically different lengths and severely curved spines. But perhaps the most heartbreaking cases were the women of reproductive age. Sarah Carmichael, the 19-year-old found with the boxes, had given birth to 4 children. The father of all 4 was her own father, Robert Carmichael, himself the product of a brother-sister union. Sarah's first child lived 3 days before dying of respiratory failure. Her second and third, born with major portions of their brains and skulls missing, had been buried within an hour of birth. Her 4th pregnancy, the one she carried when authorities arrived, ended in a stillbirth 2 weeks later. Now, think about the words Sarah managed to say to investigators, words that have echoed through medical conferences for decades: "I never knew babies could look different." If those words don't make you feel the devastating reality of this tragedy, leave a comment right now with exactly those words: "I never knew babies could look different." Let the world know you understand the unimaginable ignorance and suffering this family endured. The investigation into the burial site began in December 1973. Using ground-penetrating equipment, authorities identified an area where soil showed signs of repeated disturbance. Excavation unearthed the remains of 47 infants and small children, ranging from newborns to about 2 years old. All had died within hours or days of birth, all showing severe genetic abnormalities. Forensic pathologist Dr. Robert Chun testified, "In my 23 years of practice, I have never encountered anything like this. What this family did, while morally reprehensible by our standards, may have actually been an act of mercy compared to allowing them to live in constant agony." The legal proceedings began in March 1974, stretching across 2 years. The state charged Robert Carmichael with manslaughter, child endangerment, and illegal burial. The case presented unprecedented challenges. Robert had an IQ of approximately 52. He could not read, had no understanding of the world beyond his property, and when asked why he had relationships with his daughters, he simply responded, "That's how it's always been." The question paralyzed the system: how do you prosecute someone who lacks the mental capacity to understand their actions are wrong? Defense attorney Margaret Holloway argued Robert was as much a victim as a perpetrator, born into a century-old system of abuse with no education or capacity to comprehend alternatives. The trial drew national attention. Dr. Morrison's testimony shocked the courtroom. She explained the family's coefficient of inbreeding exceeded any in scientific literature. After 6 generations, their genetic diversity was comparable to laboratory mice bred for research. The probability of a genetically normal child being born from a union between Robert Carmichael and his daughter Sarah was quite literally zero. The prosecution argued the systematic burial of living infants constituted murder, regardless of ignorance. However, the defense revealed historical records showing government agencies had known about the family's isolation and inbreeding for decades, since at least 1880, and had chosen to do nothing. A 1951 welfare report explicitly noted their practices and genetic abnormalities but concluded no intervention was necessary. Defense attorney Holloway argued, the state of West Virginia is as guilty as Robert Carmichael, perhaps more so. They allowed this tragedy to continue because it was easier to ignore these people than to help them. After 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Robert guilty only of improper burial of human remains, not guilty of manslaughter or endangerment. His severe mental impairment and the complete failure of social services mitigated his criminal responsibility. Judge Harold Mitchell sentenced him to 5 years suspended, with conditions of sterilization and lifetime supervised care, stating, "This case represents a failure of our society on every level. Robert Carmichael is guilty, but so are we all." The remaining adult family members were also ordered to undergo sterilization, a decision upheld by the West Virginia Supreme Court in 1976. The family was dispersed to institutions. The farmhouse in Hollow Creek sat empty. Margaret Carmichael died in 1981 at age 50, never having spoken a coherent sentence. Sarah Carmichael lived until 1994, dying at 40. She never learned to read, never fully grasped the world outside Hollow Creek, and never stopped asking when she could go home. Robert Carmichael died in 1992 at 64. His death certificate listed contributing factors as severe genetic abnormalities resulting from multigenerational inbreeding. The children followed similar tragic trajectories. Caleb died before his 2nd birthday. The deaf and blind children lived into their 20s and 30s, unable to experience the world. Daniel, one of the teenage boys, learned to write and in 1985 penned, "I don't blame my family for what I am. They didn't know any better. But I do blame everyone who knew about us and did nothing. We were Americans, too. We deserved help." The farmhouse was demolished in 1978. Journals found in the basement revealed the family had not been completely ignorant of their situation. An entry from 1934 read, "Another baby came dead today. I think maybe we're just broken, but there's nothing we can do about it now." They felt trapped by isolation, poverty, tradition, and religious beliefs framing their suffering as divine will. The burial site was consecrated as a memorial in 1977. A stone marker reads, "Here rest 47 children born into suffering, denied the chance to live. May they find in death the peace denied them in life." 1903 to 1973. The Carmichael Act passed in 1976, mandating welfare checks on isolated families and funding outreach to remote Appalachian communities. Medical schools began using the case as a teaching tool. Dr. Morrison's 1998 paper, 6 Generations of Inbreeding, became one of the most cited works in human genetics. She concluded, the Carmichael family represents the end point of human genetic isolation. The family had reached a biological dead end. Today, the valley is empty. The roads have been reclaimed by nature. The last surviving member, Ruth Carmichael, who was 10 in 1973, died in 2009, marking the end of a bloodline so genetically compromised nature itself rendered it extinct. This story is a stark reminder of what happens when isolation, poverty, ignorance, and societal neglect converge. It challenges us to consider our responsibilities to the most vulnerable, and to recognize that the line between victim and perpetrator blurs when every advantage is stripped away. If you've watched to the conclusion, you've witnessed one of the darkest chapters in American social history. Confirm your subscription, because stories like this must be told, remembered, and learned from. The tragedy of the Carmichael family must not be forgotten. If you made it to the end, leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end," so I can know who truly appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit like to show respect for the 47 children who never had a chance. Share this video so others understand that behind every shocking headline is a human tragedy deserving our attention, compassion, and commitment to ensure it never happens again. The Carmichael family is gone, but their story remains a testament to the consequences of society's willingness to look away from suffering. We must do better. We must never forget.